Under a Macedon by Harold Lum. They have different titles on the back, messing with me like that. So we are in part 2, which is chapter 10 in this case, Gates of the Sea. The plan of action. If it was indeed exactly their plan, as Adrian and others relate, was amazing for two reasons. First, they ignored the probability that they might not take Tura, or that Darayavaush would attack during the siege. Second, the plan was actually carried out in all its successive steps, although the final step was taken against the bitter opposition of Parmenio and some of the staff. It called for taking successive risks amounting to a gamble, yet the gamble would be for high stakes. This daring became characteristic of Alexandros's actions, and during the next years, he began to take extreme risks for the greatest possible gain. He avoided wasting time, effort, or men for small gains, no matter how sure. The men in the ranks felt dubious about Tours. They remembered that Philip had never allowed them to be drawn into a major siege operation, while the oracles had foretold that the sea would be baneful to Alexandros. That's the thing. A sage controls the oracle. He doesn't consult it. Perhaps for this reason, or perhaps because he actually had such a dream on the shore opposite Tours, Alexandros related how the hero entity, Heracles, had appeared to him in his sleep and had taken him by the hand to guide his steps down to the shore. Called upon to explain this portent, Aristander, the Telemachon, pondered it and declared it meant that the Macedonians would succeed at Tours, but only with extreme labor, because Heracles had achieved miracles by great toil. Do your own hero deeds, people. God helps those who help themselves, The Canaanites told Diades, chief of the Macedonian engineers, that once the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Tours from the land and had gone away for a long time, leaving it as it was. After how long a time? After 15 years, said the Canaanites. Isn't between the two variations of Nebuchadnezzar the number value 666, or is it 777 or something like that? Well, it doesn't. 15 years, said the Canaanites. There were only 3 ways by which men could capture a walled city: by introducing a few men to open a gate or hold a spot on the wall so that the others could get in after them, as had been done in historic Ilium. How do you say Troy? Because it's not Troy, it's not true. Ilium. We shared that in another part. By a small band disguised as horse herders, not by the fabulous wooden horse. Or this might be accomplished by treachery. The Macedonians much preferred this first method because it was much easier to open a gate than to break it down. The second method was to batter down enough of the wall to admit the head of a storming column. This had the disadvantage that the defenders usually built a second wall inside the breach, and, after that, a barrier within the streets. The third method was to wait outside until the defenders ran out of food or otherwise broke down. None of these methods seemed to fit the case of Tours. A prolonged survey revealed to the Macedonian engineers the following situation. The island of Tours consisted of a rock foundation, with stone walls rising sheer from the rock. This island fortress lay about half a mile out from the shore. For the greater part of the way out of the water was shallow, the bottom being rock pools and reefs. Near the city, the water deepened to an 18-foot channel. Pretty narrow channel. Tur had 2 harbors, also fortified. The one on the southern side, called the Egyptian harbor, was a small indentation with a narrow entrance closed by a broom. The one on the northern side, called the Sidonian, was somewhat larger, but also in the nature of an interior basin, and its entrance could be closed by the prows of 3 war galleys moored thwart to thwart. Secured by these basins, Tur kept a small but most serviceable fleet of warships, galleys armed with sharp brazen beaks and stone-casting engines. In addition, Tur's merchant fleet carried on business as usual, bringing in supplies as needed, even some siege experts later on from the colony at Carthage. On their part, the Macedonians had no fleet, so the first and the third alternatives by which a walled city could be entered were impossible. Of course, by the first and best alternative, a few men might be landed against the walls at night, or even a gate opened by the hand of treachery. But that would serve no purpose as long as the attacking army could not follow over the water. Now, there is no record that the Macedonians ever attempted the impossible, such as, for instance, expecting untrained or weak allied troops to stand against a stronger enemy, or expecting a small garrison to hold out at a strong point against a superior force. The Macedonian army crossed snow ranges in winter, crossed great deserts in summer, joined rivers together by canals, built fleets eventually where no ships had floated before, flung bridges over great rivers in flood, found food out of strange plants and insect life where no food was known to exist. It did things that were incredible, but always possible. And the only possible alternative at Tur was to get the army inside by breaking down a section of the wall, and that meant extending the land out to a section of the wall, constructing a mole out to the wall. For the seeming impregnable Tur had the one weakness that it could not move away. This battle of the land against the sea at Tur became a conflict of engineering skill, of machine against machine, of the projection of massive rocks, the tendency of cement, the height of wooden towers, the heat of flaming naphtha and bitumen, the force and the resistance of materials. During this conflict, Alexandros often absented himself to explore the hinterland around the snow peak of Hermon and the lake called Galilee. The Macedonians called this hinterland Arabia. In doing so, the young commander vanished one night. They had been threading through the hills above the headwaters of a sluggish river, the Jordan. When they were overtaken by darkness, Alexandros kept on with a small force of Agrianians, because he did not care to camp in the hills of the Samaritans, an inhospitable people who sold him supplies but attacked and robbed stragglers. They were going single file along the heights when Alexandros met Lysimachus, the Greek tutor, had begged to come along sightseeing. Without saying anything to the men around him, Alexandros dropped back to look for Lysimachus and found him a long way back among a nest of Samaritan night fires. It did not seem as if Lysimachus could overtake the Macedonian column, nor could the two of them escape observation. In this dilemma, Alexandros took the most audacious way out. With the tired tutor scrambling after, he raced down to the nearest fire, shouting, "Here are some of them!" Beholding a Macedonian soldier coming out of the shadows in full armor, the hillmen fled, and Alexandros occupied their fire, sitting at ease and discussing Homer with Lysimachus. No one bothered them until the frightened soldiers, having missed their commander, appeared in search of them. The construction of the mole at Tura went easily. Diades and the engineers ripped down the old city of Tura on the coast for minerals. Stakes were driven to form cribs to hold sand. Crushed limestone and the foundation covered with planks. About 200 feet in width, this mole extended itself, creating a neck of land to the deep channel within 100 yards of the towering wall of Tur. There it stopped. Missile fire from the height of the wall put an end to the construction work, in spite of the protection rigged for the workers. Also, the 18-foot depth of pulsing sea was not easily filled in. The Macedonian engineers erected defense towers on the molehead as high as the wall to stop this harassing fire. Then Turian warships approached the sides of the mole and with arrow, javelin, and engine discharges made communication between the towers and shore hazardous. As a defense, the engineers set up heavy wooden barricades on the sides of the mole. The Turians shifted to launching fire missiles from the wall engines. A sheathing of fresh animal hides was put on the towers to insulate against this annoying fire. Turian science destroyed the twin towers by a most ingenious fire ship. This large vessel appeared out of a harbor, looking like anything but a ship. Weights abaft lifted high its prow. Extra masts had been stepped in this prow, with huge cauldrons slung to the yards. Pitch, brimstone, and oil filled the cauldrons. Beneath these masts, wood and plated straw had been stocked, impregnated with pitch. The crew of this floating combustible guided it against the towers, using favorable wind. They flung torches into the bow, ran into the elevated prow aground. On the molehead, between the towers, and escaped by swimming as the flames roared up against the Macedonian towers. When the fire broke through the deck, the forecastle masts fell against the towers. The cauldrons overturned, poured their chemicals into the conflagration, and the towers went up in smoke. While the army watched from the shore, the Macedonian answer to the fire ship was to broaden the mole so that the towers could be spaced further apart and more engines set up. But this new construction was raided at night by small craft from the harbors, covered by ubiquitous galleys. To the desolation of Diades and his engineers, the attempt to extend the molehead had to be abandoned. It couldn't be done, but as a pretense of activity was kept up. Alexandros and the staff had decided long before that they would have to use floating platforms, ships. They had declared a full amnesty up the coast to all mariners and owners of anything that floated. This amnesty had effect because it had become clear to the Sidonian Phoenicians, or maybe Phoenicians, the Greek, so Phoenicians. I don't. They have their own form of Aramea, so and the naval powers of islands that Alexandros meant to destroy Tur. Shipping experts from Rhodes and Byblus joined up. The war fleet of Cyprus, 120 sail, appeared unexpectedly off Sidon. Barges were towed along the coast, engines rigged on flat hulks, towers erected on the capital ships. One of 50 oars was brought over from the Macedonian coast. Nearchus of Crete and the officers with sea experience drilled the Macedonian shield-bearers and the engineers at Sidon in the use of weapons and engines aboard ship. By early summer, the summer of 332 BCE, the Macedonians had not a sea-going battle fleet, but a floating armada of siege craft, transports, and engine carriers. It was a weird-looking navy, but it almost filled the shores, the sides of the mole and the channel, and its appearance stunned the Turians. They made, of course, thrusts with their fine fighting ships, and damaged or sank a large part of the armada. Being outnumbered, the Turian ships had to strike and run back to the basins. They tried to screen their preparations to go out by rigging a curtain of sailcloth across the Sidonian harbor entrance. Alexandros, who enjoyed this matching of speed and wits, countered by moving out from the opposite side of the mole with the best of his fighting craft, and going around the island to cut off the Turian craft by racing for the harbor entrance, out of which they had come. The Macedonian floating batteries could not approach the sea wall of the island. The section opposite the molehead had been made so strong that the Macedonians did not trouble to approach it again. To use the engines, they had to anchor the craft. Divers swam out from the city and cut the rope cables of the anchors. The Macedonian engineers replaced the rope cables with chain. Turian engines, countered by dropping immense boulders, where the siege craft tried to anchor. In the offshore swell, the ships broke their bottoms on these rock points. Cranes were rigged on small barges to clear out the boulders. Assault craft were fitted with flying bridges at their mastheads to attempt landing men on the wall. The Turians countered by erecting towers that overtopped the mastheads, but the engines had shattered and broken down the wall at 2 points near the harbor entrances. The conflict no longer lay between machines. Men were beginning to exert their force against men, and Tur was doomed. The Macedonians, impatient now, and raised to a fervor pitch of hatred by the savage defense, Turians had been exhibiting prisoners on the wall summits and cutting them open by degrees, then dropping them into the sea, ended the operation by a combined assault. On a day when the sea was calm, all the shipping closed in upon the walls. The fleets made fights at the harbor mouths, while small craft, manned by archers and engineers, were run aground at the wall breaks. Actually, some of the phalanx soldiers were first over the wall from the drawbridges. 5,000 Turians died, and 30,000 were sold for slaves. The Macedonians then linked up the mole to the island. They dragged the biggest war engine into the temple as a dedication. They hauled the biggest warship into the temple square as a monument. They offered thanksgiving sacrifice in the temple of Heracles within the city, and celebrated by a parade and games. Around the broken walls, they paraded their new fleet. I took Tur, Diades said afterwards, with Alexandros' assistance. The siege of Tur had lasted for 7 months. The siege of Gaza took 2 months. That citadel on the commercial road from the Philistine coast to the land of the Pharaohs should not have closed its gates to the Macedonians. Not after Tur, not as we look back upon the event now. The fact that Gaza resisted then was an indication that its inhabitants felt the power of the great king to be nearer at hand than the Macedonians believed possible. This resistance, however, gave Diades and his engineering staff the opportunity to create their masterpiece, a causeway running up from the red sands of the plain to the summit of the wall, 250 feet above the level of the plain. The master trick, however, lay not in the construction of the gigantic ramp, but in the circumstance that within tunnels beneath it, the Macedonians excavated beneath the wall, so that when the causeway came within touch of the summit of the wall came down. The Arabians who defended Gaza were killed, fighting to a man. The women and children were sold as slaves. Gaza, however, exacted a toll from Alexandros. A bolt from a machine had smashed through his shield, breaking the bones of his left shoulder. Then the causeway was taken down, but the mole, now connecting Tur's island with the mainland, was left in place. It stretches out today to the rock foundations of ancient Tur. The Macedonians, it seems, wanted to leave citadels with small garrisons along the connecting land routes, but they wanted to leave behind them no more citadels of the sea like Tur. During the operation at Tur, Alexandros had familiarized himself with ships. He had built them, altered them, experimented with different types, until he knew the qualities of each, and how sails were set and timbers caulked. From that time on, he knew what ships could accomplish. He had worked with Nearchus and other expert mariners from the islands, although, except for his half-mile dashes around Tur and the hit-and-run skirmishing on the water, he had never sailed out on blue water. He had never set foot on the famous islands of the Aegean. Those islands of the Aegean and the Cyclades chain, the stepping stones from southern Greece to the Asiatic mainland, now acknowledged Macedonian supremacy. Tenedos and Chios opened their harbors. Some vestiges of the great king's sea power still survived, where individual officers and Greeks were shifting for themselves controlled nuclei of ships. But they were now pirates, barred from all major ports. The Macedonian army had obtained this control of the eastern Mediterranean by marching on its own legs for more than 1,500 miles around the perimeter of the sea, from the Mount Athos to Egypt. Therefore, no citadel of the sea or land in all the Mediterranean world resisted a Macedonian officer. The Macedonians kept no battle fleet on blue water. They merely occupied the shores, but when Alexandros moved on into Egypt, Aegyptus is where we get the... It wasn't called Egypt until the Greeks conquered it. He kept a fleet of galleys and transports in company. These ships drew up on the beaches at night. The crews camped with the army columns, and Alexandros created a new unit of experts, shipbuilders from Rhodes and Cyprus and Phoenicia and Egypt, with a few master mariners. With this unit, after its experience at Tur, enemy was capable of building its own fleet on strange and still unexplored waters. Down the river he sailed until he reached the sea. Around the lake Maatis he sailed, and disembarked. This spot seemed to him good for the building of a city. So says Arrian. The, the river was Nile, more precisely the western mouth of the Nile, and the city he built was Alexandria, the first of 13 or more Alexandrias. It seemed an odd thing to do for a 23-year-old Macedonian to pick out a site between a salt lake full of rushes and waterfowl on the shore of the sea, and to order work begun on the foundations and quays of a city. But instead of being odd, it was in reality inevitable. These Macedonians were pioneers, still thrusting forth to explore and create. Alexandros himself had grown up in the new capital of Pella. When Philip was a building, he had never wanted to add a cowshed to Pella itself, nor did he do so. Then he had watched how the Greeks extended across the sea by settlement cities, moving on in this fashion, cell by cell. He had just passed by their small and noisy trading port called Naucratis. Moreover, for months, he had been marching almost in the white froth of the surf, studying the way of ships upon the sea, listening to navigators like Nearchus. Now he had come to the end of that march, with power to direct that sea-borne traffic. Moreover, he had reached, at the end of his Mediterranean campaign, a quiet land, drawing life from a ceaselessly flowing river, the water of which might have been destined to flow through the desert in this fashion by the unseen. At Heliopolis and Memphis he had beheld cities of permanent stone, of dark porphyry and gleaming limestone, cut into massive shapes, wherein stone figures of monsters and beneficent entities were so illuminated by sunlight that they seemed to live and breathe. Some of these temples had stood for a millennium before stones were laid in place on the small Acropolis at Athens. So had the people existed here, unchanging, carving their records in pictographs and script upon these walls of stone. They had endured, and what they had built would be destroyed by no tumult in the marketplace or advent of an invader. Alexandros observed much and remembered much. His width of imagination came from no uncontrolled impulses of the mind, but from the immense field over which his mind had passed. There wasn't even a passage in Homer about this spot, where an island lies within sounding surf, an island, Pharos, on the Egyptian shore. After his exploration of the Ionian coast, he had appreciation of the tracks followed by commerce. Here the Nile River traffic might meet the coastal road, the coastal route. At all events, this mouth of the Nile lay closest to Crete and the ports of Greece. Ships could anchor in the great saltwater basin, protected from the outer surf. Evidently, Alexandros meant it to be far more than a port. It was to be the first construction of a new type of metropolis, although resembling Corinth in many respects, a combination of seaport, international settlement, and center of worship and study. For in place of the small pillar serving as lighthouse at the end of Pharos, he planned an immense lighthouse and observatory, matching the height of the royal pyramids up the Nile, having the square sky scraping tower of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. He asked for an academy vaster than the squat stone buildings of Mysa, and apparently without the nymphs of the garden. He called for a temple to be laid down, like the one at Sardis, a gymnasium, and a sports arena, such as had been built during the long halt on the coast back of Macedon. Lastly, he requested a library, a whole building to house books, such has been seen, such had been seen, such as he had seen at Memphis. If Diades had besieged Tours with Alexandros' assistance, Alexandros planned his first metropolis with Diades' assistance. He liked to employ the engineer corps upon something more useful than destruction. It was not so strange that he should build Alexandria as that he should build it here on the shore of Egypt. A story persists that Alexandros wanted to mark out on the ground the lines of the city's wall before he left. No one seemed to have any serviceable markers on the spot, so they took the ground barley from the jars of the soldiers' kits and made heavy white lines where Alexandros paced off the ground. By the time they had finished, the birds from the marsh were flocking in like a cloud and eating up the barley. Alexandros and the builders were arrested by this unexpected omen. They called in Aristander and other soothsayers to explain it. Oh yeah, we really need soothsayers to explain that one. Have you ever tried to plant without actually covering the holes and have a whole row and, have to fight off the birds if you're, it's better just to cover, Alexandros and the builders were arrested by this unexpected omen. They called in Aristander and other soothsayers to explain it. Even Aristander seemed to be at a loss for a while, and then he said that the city would prosper, but only from the harvest of the earth. Others said that Alexandria, when built, would feed multitudes. In any event, it prospered. It prospered and it grew. Today, after more than 2,277 years, when was this book wrote? Anyways, it is still a great naval base and something of an international settlement, but it is no longer a world center of worship and learning. And I was told once that here's this task you're to do, throwing seeds about. Stuff grew up, but not as well as planting and rightly spaced and stuff. And birds got a bunch of it, so